PsychForce Report.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mangan.
And I'm Rob Wipond, and this is PsychForce Report TV.
So there was a recent PsychForce Report article where you were expanding upon some things that were discussed in New York Times articles recently. They were talking about Acadia healthcare. Can you talk a bit about Acadia and the questions that are being raised about the Acadia healthcare practices throughout the United States?
Yeah, so this was a good article, in fact, in the end, a series of articles from the New York Times investigating the fraudulent incarceration of people in 24 states across America, fraudulent incarceration under mental health laws, fraudulent involuntary commitments, essentially, entirely done for profit. And this was in the wake of a Department of Justice investigation that's been going on for years. And prior to that, really, there's been pretty good media coverage of some of these cases around the country. And so I thought it was just important to kind of summarize that because I think it highlights some really important issues. Of course, it was getting a ton of traction in the mainstream media overall. People were talking about this. Oh my goodness, outrage, fraudulent commitment. But at the same time, a whole series of other much more important and related questions were not being raised that were kind of concerning me. And that's what I start to explore in the rest of my article. But yeah, I mean, when you saw some of that Acadia healthcare, what struck you about those cases?
It's a really complicated experience because I do want to applaud the New York Times for allowing their journalists to follow this through. There's just the New York Times has not been historically fantastic about covering this issue with any real depth. Most mainstream media outlets, actually all, are not historically great about covering this conversation in any real depth. So I applaud that. Thank you. But on the other hand, I guess what does it take? Like how many decades of people saying, I was harmed by this, I was traumatized, this was unnecessary. How many decades of people saying that is adequate? And it seems like the thing that really, well, I guess maybe two of the factors that really contributed to this article being one that got attention was one that one of the primary people they were interviewing was a social worker with experience with the system. And there's a sense of legitimacy there when someone with clinical experience can say this was wrong. But two, money, fraud. If it's fraud, then all of a sudden it's a story, I guess. But if it's just dehumanization and traumatization of a person in distress, is it important enough? Is it catchy enough?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what's so interesting about these cases, right? Is they actually end up describing what is in fact a fairly routine process of involuntary commitment. And it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. The restraints, the threats, the intimidation, the forced drugging, people's clothes being taken off and forcibly injected. And people are horrified by it. And as you're saying, somehow we don't experience the same horror when it's a legitimate forced treatment as opposed to a clearly one done with intention for profit making. The line there is so questionable. And another thing that concerned me that you're highlighting, really, it's part of what you're pointing to, is so they did not emphasize very much that this is the reason the Department of Justice investigated, really the reason the New York Times got as much information they did. I'm sure a lot of it was coming from those cases and the people that the Department of Justice were contacting. A lot of it had to do with the fact that these were Medicare and Medicaid cases. So essentially, although they featured some apparently maybe more well-to-do people who had private insurance, and that's playing into this as well, some of these people were probably poor, elderly, homeless even, and you can still make money off of those people with these fraudulent involuntary commitments. I think that's so important to highlight, particularly in New York right now, right? Where there's all this promotion, even in the New York Times, aggressively promoting the idea of, hey, let's incarcerate forcibly treat more homeless people. And somehow this connection is not being made. And I find that really disturbing.
Yeah, there's another aspect that I think is a lot harder to engage with publicly, which is these are allegations of Acadia fraudulently and involuntarily hospitalizing people, often holding them right up to the point of a court date, because going to court costs more money, and then releasing them. So there are allegations, and the question becomes like, were they doing this wrong? Were these the bad involuntary hospitalizations? But the reality is, the law is set up in a way that gives all discretion to the people doing the hospitalization. So you have to prove intent. You have to prove knowingly defrauding an institution in order to prove that it was fraud. Because even if a clinician is involuntarily hospitalizing someone and they're on the fence, like could 50-50, could go either way, that's legal. You could legally have a clinician being like, I don't know, so I'm going to hospitalize them and see what happens. So I guess the public needs to hear fraud. They need to hear this was demonstrably illegal to really engage with it in a way. But the truth is, that's not a clear distinction because the laws are set up in such a way that completely stacks the deck against the person being forced into a hospital.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I explore in the rest of the article that I wrote. We talk about, we see this sort of reaction from a psychiatrist writing in Psychiatric Times expressing legitimate horror, really, as we are, and as many did in response to the New York Times coverage of these fraudulent involuntary commitments. And I applauded him for that. And I do applaud him for that, for speaking out to say, why aren't more psychiatrists speaking out with concern about this kind of a situation? And yet, when I delved into, well, who is this person? I became more interested in his writing overall when I was appreciative of this. And I discovered that there's all sorts of other articles the same psychiatrist has written where he's essentially justifying and rationalizing the pseudoscientific approach to doing diagnoses and defending it from critics of psychiatry and saying, well, yes, it is somewhat pseudoscientific. However, this is what we need to do, and it's perfectly appropriate, and it's the best we can do, and so on and so forth. And apparently he's oblivious to how that is playing out in these kinds of situations, that kind of attitude that psychiatrists have, that what they're doing is purely helping in all cases, and it's fine even if you're fudging it, even if you're kind of making some things up as you go along. And admittedly, he doesn't talk a lot about involuntary commitment at the same time as he's talking about these sort of pseudoscientific aspects of psychiatry. But that's what interested me a lot, to kind of say, well, what is this person not putting these things together? I mean, did you sort of see that kind of tension as well in his essay?
First of all, I want to acknowledge that Moorhead in some of his writings identifies himself as a person who's living with mental illness, and I respect that. Anything he says about his own personal experiences and struggles should be respected and should be listened to. That being said, he compares people who get involuntarily hospitalized to people who show up in an ER unconscious. And he talks about people who show up in an ER unconscious as being involuntarily treated. That's not involuntary treatment, that's unaware of treatment. But when you compare that to involuntary, to people who say no, to people who say, stop, you're hurting me, and you say, well, we can ignore that because they're similar to people who are unconscious. You've created a culture where consent can be ignored based off of personal opinion. If I think this person has a serious mental illness, these seem to be some of the arguments Moorhead is making. If I think this person has a serious mental illness, as a psychiatrist, I have a duty to respond and force them into treatment if I think it's necessary. And the thing hanging over all of this that needs to be addressed is psychiatrists are operating within a legal system. They're operating within a legal system where they're given virtual immunity to act on opinion, to deprive other people of their rights. And this to me seems like And I'm sorry I get like this
Yeah,
really.
well, yeah, no, I can understand totally. And the issue you're highlighting, the key issue there, where Moorhead makes the comparison of the involuntarily committed patient to somebody who's literally unconscious from a car crash. It's so disturbing, right? It's so fundamentally like abusive, really, such an approach. And I've also heard people make comparisons to, oh, it's like somebody with severe dementia who, has no idea who they are, where they are, what they're doing. And it's like, this is not the reality of the average involuntarily committed patient. As we know, this person is often very alert, often very smart in many ways. And yes, some people do get into states where, they may have unusual beliefs. They may have heightened levels of fear, anxiety, things going on, some sort of self-destructive attitudes happening, things like that. But rarely are they people that are out of it, like, somebody with severe Alzheimer's might be in an advanced stage, or like an unconscious car crash. This comparison is so fundamentally insulting and abusive and revealing of exactly what you're talking about, this sort of over the top lack of sort of real ethical balance in the application of it. And indeed, this is what, I go on to explore in the rest of the article too, by, okay, let's take this out of a profit-making environment altogether, and let's look at a recent investigation that was done at the Veterans Health Administration. So we had this case of a fellow in his 30s who was literally described, as it sounds like you were in your situation. He was described as being as alert and goal-oriented. He recognized he was having some difficulties. He actually wanted help. He had actually, in this case, gone there voluntarily to a VA hospital seeking help, and he was locked up against his will. And despite the fact that even in the medical records, this investigation found by the Inspector General, that in the medical records, all the staff were saying that he was alert and smart and just concerned for himself and wanted help and voluntary. He was still marked off by the treating psychiatrist, the treating doctor, as lacking insight, having anosognosia, as not a voluntary patient, not recognizing his need for treatment, and held against his will. And he immediately protested. He immediately found this very distressing, to lose all his rights. He correctly was concerned that this could be a very serious black mark on his record, on his service record, on his medical records, to have been involuntarily committed. He said, I came here voluntarily. Eventually, he persuaded, it took more than a day, he persuaded them to convert him to a voluntary patient again. But by this time, he was so traumatized by the experience, he left and he launched a bunch of protests and complaints within the system and got no response. And sadly, terribly, he ultimately took his own life. He never sought mental health help again, even though he'd been getting regular mental health help for a couple of years. He'd just been not satisfied with it. It was a bit, people were coming and going. He didn't have consistent treatment, and so he'd gone to the hospital for that reason. So this is how that ends. So the Inspector General does this investigation and finds that this is not uncommon, and that one of the things the VHA is regularly doing in this whole area region they had looked at in Florida, in the Florida, Georgia area, was 26 different hospitals, I think, were involved. They found that this was fairly routine, that patients would come in voluntarily seeking help, clearly then showing insight into their illness and their need for treatment, as it were, and were nevertheless being detained against their will, declared involuntary patients. And despite the fact that this was basically fraud, and there was no profit per se being made. Obviously, still money is changing hands in this kind of environment. People are making livelihoods, but it's not like a profiteering venture. And yet this is widespread.
A big part of it is clinical culture that, I mean, I know I've experienced it, and I've heard from other people who've experienced it, where it is really, it can be just really difficult to bring yourself to the point where you're vulnerable enough to ask for help. And so whatever struggle you go through to reach that point, when you ask for help, the moment that voluntary is turned into an involuntary, the moment your autonomy is taken away for no discernible or justifiable reason, there's a betrayal that is intrinsically wounding. Like it's just existentially something happened to me where once I was dumped out of that gurney into a psych ward without any explanation for why me asking for help has led me here. And that nurse comes up to me and takes my belt and my shoelaces. Like there's just this schism that is created in how vulnerable I had to be. They just spent hours telling me to be vulnerable, to talk about everything, to trust them. And they took that trust and they traumatized me with it. And so I don't think there is enough attention or effort in clinical culture to talking about the repercussions of that sort of betrayal and to really listening to the people who have felt that betrayal. And beyond that, voluntary doesn't mean voluntary. Nowhere in the United States does voluntary mean voluntary. Voluntary means you can ask to leave and they might decide to keep you. There's no need to make someone involuntary if they're asking to be voluntary. Voluntary inherently means we decide when you go.
Yeah, I think what people don't really know if they haven't been through it or haven't researched it is how thin that line is, right? And this is what that VHA investigation was showing, that it's really very arbitrary. And essentially, yeah, even though you are a voluntary patient, exactly what you're saying is correct, that a person can, if they so much as then say, well, I don't want that particular drug, I prefer this one. I actually have changed my mind. I no longer like this place. It doesn't feel like it's helping me. I'd go. It's a very thin line where they can then say, well, you're no longer showing the insight that we thought you were a minute ago, so now we're going to hold you against your will. And in fact, this is even written into laws in some states to make it easier to do, where it literally will say that if you do not agree with the psychiatrist's recommendations, you can be converted from voluntary to involuntary. This is actually the wording in the law. I think people don't realize that. And I also think that a lot of people don't understand. Yeah, it's just that moment. It's a very visceral, powerful moment that many people have described to me, that just like you suddenly realize I'm being held in seclusion in a room with a locked door. I've not been allowed to talk to a lawyer. I don't know what my rights are, if I have any. These people are threatening me with forcible injections and restraints, and it's the fear can go through the roof instantly, and even an ordinary person, let alone a person who's not in an ordinary state, but perhaps for whatever reason, genuinely going through a difficult period in their lives, feeling very vulnerable, feeling afraid, anxious already, and suddenly this is happening to them in this heightened state. It can be really, really powerful, very, very traumatizing. And I think people need to visualize that when we're having these discussions, what's really happening. Because we're often just saying, oh, well, we're trying to help, so surely that's good enough. We'll know, even if that is your intention to help, this is a very sort of threatening experience. And I want to get on to the other case that I included as part of this because it's directly relevant. So now we have an investigation that was done in Prince Edward Island, a province of Canada, so a completely different healthcare system. Again, an independent investigation by the Auditor General of that province, looking at a whole bunch of hospitals again, so not like about one doctor or one place, one bad apple, no, systemically. And here in this case, they didn't even look at the question, were they justifiably incarcerated or not? They didn't even have the kinds of records they would need, they found, to really investigate that. But that was not what they were looking at. They were looking at, once you were there, were you being at least properly informed of what was going to play out, what your rights were, just handled in a reasonable way as a reasonable person, right? And what they found is no. systemically across the board in the majority of cases, not even a large minority, but the majority of cases, they found that people were not told that they even had the right to appeal these incarcerations. They weren't told how. Even if they did know and they launched an appeal, the staff were routinely not passing it on to the authorities to get the process in place. The actual supposedly independent mental health review board, the organization, the agency that would be hosting these appeals, wasn't keeping proper records. They couldn't, I think in half of cases, they said that they couldn't even indicate whether the patients had even been notified of the outcome of the hearing. So just, across the board, just poor record keeping and routine abuses. They also found that it was routine to hold people longer than was legally allowed. So blatant law breaking happening at every level of the system. Once again, no profit motive involved. And so this is where I try to, I say, we really need to think about what's happening here. Why is this happening? Why would psychiatrists and medical staff routinely in all these different kinds of systems, whether for profit or not, be breaking the law, be not educating patients about their rights, not allowing their rights, routinely being actually blatantly fraudulent, like falsifying records? That's the phrase the Department of Justice used in the Acadia case, falsifying records. That's the similar phrase to what the VHA was doing. They were literally lying in the records in order to justify involuntarily committing people. And so it's a natural question to say, why? Why is this happening? Yeah, I invite you to share some of your thoughts on that. I obviously start developing some myself.
I think it's the easiest thing to do. It is important to acknowledge that in Canada and in the United States, there are clinicians and facilities that are just overrun, overworked, understaffed, under-resourced. That's an important thing to think about. But I think the problem is it is easier to sacrifice the rights of vulnerable people than it is to acknowledge the real structural changes that would need to happen. Like the clinician on the ground can't change the structural problems. They can't change the problems that lead to people being unhoused. They can't change the problems that lead to people not having enough services and leading them to be in a point of acute crisis and distress. They can't do that. But what they can do, they can fudge a record here. They can hold a person a little bit longer. Maybe it's a mistake, maybe it's not. Clinicians aren't really encouraged, at least in my experience, they aren't strongly encouraged to do an in-depth dive into the law. It just doesn't matter because what's the worst that happens? The patient protests. They're a person who needed to be involuntarily hospitalized. Of course they're going to protest. And apart from the potential trauma and just destruction of a life, taking someone away from their kids, taking someone away from their job, taking someone away from being able to pay for housing. Sort of apart from that, it can ruin the trajectory of a life because if you have that on your record, like with a person who had served in the military and comes out of the military, honorably discharged, like the person you wrote about, honorably discharged, seeking help, and that involuntary hospitalization then puts them in a position where they may not be able to ever own a firearm. They become exempt from all sorts of careers, security clearances, military consulting, like all of these things that a military career history might set you up for have just been taken away. So your job security for that, I'm assuming, I make a lot of assumptions, but for this person, their entire job trajectory may have been crippled and taken away by whoever made that decision to unnecessarily transfer or make a voluntary into an involuntary.
You're talking about the VHA guy again, right? Who with the military, the vet who, yeah, would probably have lost his security clearances as a result of that involuntary commitment, and that was his concern. And indeed, that is quite common. And of course, there are tons of other potential repercussions. There are licensing bodies and law and doctoring, even where, if you have that kind of thing on your history, they'll often probe it. This has been battled out legally in certain states right now, whether or not they should be allowed to do that, but many states they currently do. And so you can be not allowed to ascend to the bar in your state. You might not be allowed to become some sort of other professional where licensing is involved if you have this kind of medical history. So Susan Steffen's written, of course, a tremendous book called Unequal Rights, which really explores in extraordinary depth how getting any kind of mental disability label on you can just deprive you of all sorts of rights, even the right to get a driver's license in certain states. The right to vote in certain states is still technically on the books. Some of these aren't being enforced, but it's still there on the books. So yeah, the huge consequences of all this. One of the things, I think you were touching on and that really highlighted for me in all this is the extraordinary power imbalance that the system sets up. And I just think it's inevitable in that environment that it becomes abusive, because the moment I don't have to care about you, right? The moment we somehow have a power relationship where I have power over your life, but I don't have to actually care about the repercussions of that for you, right? Unless I want to. That's an abusive situation. I'm bound, even if I have nothing but the best intentions in relation to you. It can be extremely difficult for me not to, in some way, be insensitive, right? To make decisions that are going to feel to you like I just swatted you around without care. And so not only have we set up a legal system like that, now we're allowing these medical staff, these doctors, even these review boards, to fundamentally ignore the little bit of due process we have in place to try to protect people like you or me in that situation when we're in a vulnerable situation. And that's what I find really, really concerning. And I think more people have to speak up about it. And it disturbs me to no end that we don't see more psychiatrists speaking out about that. And that was my ultimate objection to Moorhead's framing of this and any other critical practitioners I've seen, is often they don't attack the very heart of the laws and of the lack of due process, or even of this illegal behavior sometimes, because they perpetrate it themselves. They just sort of question the intention. And that's ultimately, of course, so subjective that we can't really rely on it. That's why we create due process procedures in these kinds of environments. And so it's enormously disturbing to me that they're being ignored. And I have to say that we saw this play out in British Columbia and Canada not so long ago, where the ombudsperson did an investigation there. 25 years later, they came back and said, I'm still seeing the same levels of systemic abuses of patients' rights, and highlighted a bunch of recommendations, which the government agreed to. And then a couple of years later, then came back to say, okay, have you actually implemented this? And found that in the first case, it was something like only 28% of psychiatric incarcerations were actually legal. And in the second case, even though everybody now knew they were being watched, they were being investigated, the ombudsperson was coming back to check on changes, not even 50% were legal under and British Columbia already has one of the most aggressive, abusive processes in place. So they have very few rights, but doctors were routinely ignoring these rights anyway. And so we can't help but say this is just a really kind of over the top, what's the word for it? Fascistic desire for power that we're seeing centralized in this entire profession. And until the profession kind of wakes up, self-questions, and I don't know if they're going to, there has to be some sort of public uprising against it to hold them to account. And even with these investigations, we're not really seeing that accountability emerging yet. And so there needs to be a lot more public attention and organizing to try to stop this.
I think one of the things that for me makes it almost worse, and I've got this sense from Moorhead's writing, he may genuinely believe he is the vanguard, the savior of his patients, that he has a responsibility to save people, and sometimes that requires taking their rights away.
Well,
And
indeed. And I just want to say Acadia's response has been that, right? They've said, no, no, no. They never admitted that they were committing fraud, right? They never admitted to that. They said, no, we're doing actually best practices, is what they described it as. So that's important. Anyway, I didn't want to interrupt, but just to
well,
highlight, right?
I
That's
I think
exactly it.
I think that goes to everything, like in terms of comparing the United States to Canada. How could the same thing be happening in different legal systems and different healthcare systems? It's a culture, it's a concept of best practice, which isn't founded in robust research. I mean, Moorhead writes at one point about like the catch-22 of, we know that involuntary hospitalizations cause trauma, but not involuntarily hospitalizing someone causes trauma too. So what do you do? It's like, well, show me the research where we stopped involuntarily hospitalizing people. Show me the moment in our country, in this nation's history, where we stopped doing it and what the horrible outcome was. I'm not saying that I know what the outcome would be. I'm saying if you want to make a claim, back it up. And I think that's one of the things that really frustrates me about it is I've spoken to psychiatrists who I respect, who acknowledge when they have limitations, who really wrestle with being in a system that they don't know how to fix and having to deal with people in distress and knowing that they're just dealing with an individual. They can't fix the system. So I've spoken to psychiatrists that I respect. Someone like Moorhead, though, he's in Massachusetts. I've been through the Massachusetts system. Massachusetts that has one of, if not the highest rate of involuntary hospitalizations in the country. The Massachusetts legal system has more due process than a lot of other places. But I can tell you that it's not a guarantee. It's not always respected. And so I've been through the system that Moorhead, I'm assuming, is surrounded by. And if he can't see the flaws in that system, if he's so engrossed in that clinical culture that he can't realize there are important questions to be raised, then I don't know what to say other than you don't speak for me and don't try to. You're not my savior. I don't need you to be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, one other point you highlighted too, which is that, the justifications for involuntary commitment, uh, really across the board in our society often, but particularly from psychiatrists as well, it's often anecdotal, right? A story. Oh, so and so was doing something sounded really dangerous, and then, we locked them up, and it would have been far worse if we didn't, even if they were totally traumatized and humiliated, and by this experience, ultimately somehow we saved them. It's like a little anecdotal story that, of course, it's impossible. You don't even know the details yourself, so you can't refute those. And it just sounds like somebody got saved. So, okay, but that's it. In terms of the research, right? In terms of the actual research we have on this, well, there's no support for it. That's why they never cite it. The best research we have shows, guess what? As soon as you introduce real coercion to people, when you start threatening them, intimidating them, restraining them, forcing them against their express will, they hate it. They're traumatized by it. They rarely, almost never say, "Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much," in that kind of environment. They'll say thank you very much if it's a very, very non-coercive type of experience where they're treated respectfully. Yes, that can happen, but not in this. When you see coercion in the research, you see coercion going up, you see satisfaction declining, and you see trauma increasing, right? We know this. And so that's why it's never cited. But that's the danger of all this, right? Is it's now built on this highly sort of subjective framing.
And I think if people really want to go deeper in this and sort of ask questions, like look at the research of Nev Jones, who's done research particularly with, I think, juveniles and coercion. Look at the work of Morgan Shields, who's looked at the sort of the safety related to hospitalizations and involuntary commitments largely. Look at the work of David Cohen, who did one of the largest, I think, ever studies about rates of involuntary hospitalization and commitment in the United States. And like part of this is talking about the veteran that was in Florida. A few years ago, the Southern Poverty Law Center released a report on the rates of children being involuntarily hospitalized in Florida. I think it was somewhere around 37,000 in 1 year, around 37,000 children as young as 4 years old being involuntarily hospitalized in the state of Florida using the Baker Act. People would be held, kids would be held until the point of a court trial and then released. The trauma of that is sort of hard to grasp, but one of the biggest pipelines of this was the school system. And people who didn't really know what they were supposed to do. Police officers didn't know whether or not they could challenge what a teacher was saying. Teachers thinking, I've got to report this or else my job's on the line. And this entire system of funneling children as young as 4 years old into involuntary hospitalizations. If you want to be a clinician talking about the things, the doubts in your profession that need to be pointed out, that seems like something that you should be talking about. That seems like something you would want to elevate.
Yes, that sounds like a good place for us to wrap up too, is encouraging other people to speak out more about this. And so thank you for sharing your story today, and of course, all of your great insights and perspectives on this with me. It's fun chatting as always.
Thank you. And there'll be more PsychForce Report to come as soon as I calm down.
That's actually a nice ending. I like that.
PsychForce Report. 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 PsychForce Report.